I moved to Montgomery in September, and I took this position as a race and ethnicity reporter because I felt like, as a Black journalist, what you do, what you write about, what you give time to, really impacts people's daily lives on a day-to-day basis. So I think that, that's part of the importance of local news, and it's part of why it needs to really be protected. Hi, I'm Safiya Charles, and I am reading my essay, Food as a Weapon and Salve, The Legacies of Georgia Gilmore. On March 8, 1990, doctors admitted Georgia Gilmore to Jackson Hospital in Montgomery, Alabama. A rupture in her intestines had caused fluid to leak and inflame her abdomen. She had no idea she was sick. The 70-year-old civil rights activist was ready to cook heavy for guests soon to arrive from across the country. She died on March 9th. When those guests gathered in Montgomery to mark the 25th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights, they joined mourners of Gilmore's life. Together they ate the food she prepared before she fell ill, her tender-cooked chicken and baked macaroni and cheese. For decades, Gilmore had served a full dinner in her dining room, where guests, who often entered her home without knocking, crowded around the table 12 or more at a time. Others spilled into the living room, edging in for a seat on the couch if they could manage to find one, or else ate where they stood. Each day, she prepared 2 slow-cooked meats, baked or fried chicken and spare ribs. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. loved her stuffed pork chops. She cooked turnip greens, potato salad and turkey dressing, with corn muffins and pound cake or a slice of pie, washed down with sweet tea. 1 week after her death, St. Jude Catholic Church hosted her funeral service. You would have thought she was a world figure, Mark, her son, recalled in a 2004 interview with journalist Jamie York. The church was packed to capacity, and you know what's amazing, he said, thinking about his mother's long fight against racism and injustice? She had the police as pallbearers. When I imagine Gilmore, who worked as a cook most of her life, hunched over the stove, likely humming a tune, I think of my own grandmother, who grew up on the island of Tobago. She cared for 14 children and reared grand and great-grandchildren until the day she died. She, too, passed after an unobserved illness took residence inside her. My grandmother grew up a long way from Alabama, but her story connects. In her 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston writes, "Black women are the mules of the world. They show up, they do the work, they carry the load, and suffer the consequences of its burden." We are so much more than that, and we have made our country the better for it, at times paying dearly for our efforts. 3 decades after Gilmore's death, and more than 80 years after Hurston wrote those words, we see this in the massive burden Black women bear in the current health crisis. 28% of Black women in the United States work in the service industry. They are the nursing assistants, cashiers, and home health aides. And right now, they are disproportionately filling our hospital beds and dying of COVID-19. For their labor, they earn an average of 63 cents for every dollar earned by a white man. That's only 58 cents in Alabama and 56 cents in Mississippi. Women like Gilmore and my grandmother were of humble stock. They did plenty with little, and most without a lot. They refused to succumb to despair or defeat. They labored from the time their dark hair shone in youthful plaits until their coils faded to gray. Much of what people know about Gilmore as a civil rights figure surrounds her fundraising for the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, she founded the Club from Nowhere, a clandestine organization of women who cooked and sold food to raise money for the ongoing protest. As the weeks became a year, Gilmore turned in more and more money to fund the volunteer taxis and carpools that ferried Black passengers across town. We know less about Gilmore's personal character. Those who knew her described her as larger than life. We also know too little about her continued activism, which, in the years after the Montgomery bus boycott ended, permanently altered the landscape of the city of Montgomery. It could also be that many of the unsung heroes of the movement were women. Active as they were in the struggle, Gilmore and other Black women were the foundation of the movement. Their efforts remain lesser known now because so few enjoyed visible prominence back then. From here in 2020, 3 things strike me. 2 offer perspective. She used food as a weapon and a salve. She gained empowerment through her participation in the bus boycott. The 3rd begs me to take a hard look at the misogynoir and relative disinterest employed by Montgomery's newspapers to tell her story. Everyone from visiting presidents to local students and politicians from the state capitol had to have a taste of Gilmore's cooking. John F. Kennedy requested her food be brought to his plane as it waited on the tarmac. But her enterprise was born of necessity. About 3 months into the year-long boycott, Gilmore made her allegiance clear. In March 1956, she swore in court that Reverend Martin Luther King had not attempted to incite anyone to stay off the buses, as he was being accused by the state. For this, she was fired from her job as a cook at a downtown restaurant. Gilmore couldn't even get homeowners insurance to cover her house, Mark told a reporter, because her involvement in the movement was so known among whites. Gilmore's dining room table served several purposes. It was a secure meeting place for talk that had to be kept quiet. King and Montgomery Improvement Association leaders could move and speak freely, hold private meetings with public officials even, as was the case when King once brought President Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Kennedy to Gilmore's home. The unsanctioned restaurant fed and nourished, in the physical sense and in the cultural and political sense. Looking to the current mass movement of protests and disruptions that now sweep the nation following the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others at the hands of police, they have also incorporated food as a means of sustenance and empowerment. Food production and consumption as fuel, as politic, as a means of power, is a long-standing concept. As the bus boycott showed, the work of Black women could propel a movement. But the production of food is often stigmatized. The ongoing devaluation of Black women's work points to why many people like Gilmore, who powered the boycott and greater civil disruption, remain relatively unknown. Huge Negro woman draws cursing fine, read the headline in the Alabama Journal on November 3, 1961. The reporter likely recognized the name of the woman in question because Gilmore had appeared in their paper before. But the reporter instead chose to identify the business owner and activist by her size, race, and sex. It's the adjective huge that's really doing the most work in the headline. It speaks to a perceived unruliness and to the stereotype of a large, disorderly Black female figure in need of censure. Or maybe it's just there for comic relief. When Jean Kavorik of my paper, the Montgomery Advertiser, wrote in November of 1961, a hefty Negro woman who weighed in excess of 230 pounds was fined $25 today in city court on charges of cursing a diminutive white garbage truck driver. He worked a twist on the sassy Black mammy archetype, and he rendered the white male truck driver her victim. The Advertiser dropped the word huge in a follow-up headline the next day. Big Negro woman fined $25 for cursing garbage man. That said, the first line of the story employs it. A huge Negro woman was convicted in Recorder's Court Friday for cursing the white driver of a city sanitation department truck. By that point, Gilmore had already been quoted or mentioned by name in the Advertiser at least 4 times. The discourtesies of 1961 follow a period in which Gilmore made the paper as an activist for civil and voting rights and agitator for equitable city services. In 1956, the newspaper quoted her testimony from King's trial. In December 1958, she challenged a city racial ordinance. On New Year's Eve 1958, when she is mentioned as plaintiff in a federal suit, Georgia Gilmore versus the city of Montgomery. And last, in September of 1959, she is mentioned in a story about the invalidation of the racial ordinance. But I believe that coverage is worthy of attention now, as many newsrooms across the country begin the very late-term work of assessing and dismantling the historical biases and erasures that have alienated and marginalized Black and othered communities. My own presence at the Advertiser, as the sole Black female reporter, is meant to demonstrate a commitment to this effort. But the reality is, our newspaper now faces down decades of rightfully earned mistrust from African Americans. Only time, persistence, and ongoing engagement with the communities harmed can yield good faith. For what it's worth, the Advertiser's posture on Gilmore seems to have relaxed just a few years later. In 1964, in a story on the wedding of her daughter, Oscar May, the reporter is generous, describing the bride with elegant language and telling the readers that the bride's mother wore a baby blue, satin-brocaded dress with Black accessories. Acknowledgement of her activism, however, does not come until November of 1980. Thinking of 1955 and 1956 and Gilmore's involvement in the bus boycott, I'm fascinated by how her acts of civil disobedience appear to have changed her mindset and shaped her life, as she embraced the power and responsibility she earned. Before 1955, Gilmore, like most working-class Black women, had sometimes endured the mistreatment of drivers on the city's buses, because when you're Black and poor and a woman, you do what you must to survive. For Gilmore, to not only resist but to triumph must have felt thrilling. It was just the idea that you could make the white man suffer and let the white man realize that you could get along in the world without him, Gilmore said in a 1979 interview about her participation in the boycott. In the moment, the women were unaware of the power they possessed as a workforce. Although Black women have long maintained the highest rate of labor force participation among all women. They were treated as members of the city's permanent underclass. They washed for whites, cooked, cleaned their households, and fed their children. They kept the municipality and its economy churning. Today, we would likely call these Black women essential workers. You see, Black women were maids, cooks, and they was the one that really and truly kept the bus running. And after the maids and the cooks stopped riding the bus, well, the bus didn't have any need to run, Gilmore said. In a 1986 interview with Eyes on the Prize, a multi-part documentary that chronicled the civil rights movement, Gilmore told the interviewer that before the boycott, she had grown dependent on the system. By walking or carpooling, she realized that she could do just fine without the bus. Working for herself, She proved she could do without a white employer, too. White Montgomery, on the other hand, couldn't survive without her. Before the bus boycott, I couldn't drive. But after the bus boycott began, I was able to drive. And then I was able to save enough money to get a car. And then I was really a big shot, because I felt that I had come up in the world, being able to drive and say, well, I own the car, Gilmore said. The movement had granted her agency. The movement had empowered her. It's hard to think of a contemporary who matches Gilmore's force and character, but many Black women continue to fight for and champion their communities. Women like Lunsford, the Tuskegee-based specialist who advocates for racial equity in food systems, farmer and food sovereignty activist Leah Penniman, chef and writer Adrienne Lipscomb, land justice advocate and organizer Dara Cooper, and food historian Zella Palmer, to name just a few. We must commit to listening, amplifying, and supporting Black female leadership. Gilmore and so many Black women before and after her have demonstrated the courage, will, and sense necessary to effect great change. They have done this work from both inside and outside their communities. Georgia Gilmore was an activist and a domestic worker, a mother, protector, a midwife and widow. She was a cook, a witness, a restaurateur, a hustler, a wisecrack, a fed-up citizen, a singer, an appellant, a democratic purist, a civil rights hero, and a regular person. She was a hard-working Black woman worthy of respect. She was not a mule. Know her, celebrate her, embody her legacy. Thank you.